Actually, I'm sort of in sympathy with Justin because I think I'm going to give you the classic academic answer to any hard question. It depends. It depends, I think, on what your creative process is. It depends on how you as a filmmaker make films, or how you think you want to make films. Because in the classic studio system, say the 20s through the 50s, I would argue most of those filmmakers didn't know the film classics. I'd be very surprised if John Ford, studied The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or Howard Hawks knew much about The Battleship Potemkin. And these were, of course, films that were contemporary films, but already being hailed as classics for them. What they did have, though, was an infrastructure that could train them in a tradition. So their creative process was very much embedded in the institution of the Hollywood studio system, and they didn't need to see films by Ince or films by Griffith, although probably they did see some by Griffith, because that was already, all those strategies of creation were embedded in the institution that they were being apprenticed in and learning through. So in a way, they got a film education through the business. At the same time, though, there were filmmakers of both, chiefly overseas, who were film nuts, who were cinephiles. People like Hitchcock, people like Ozu and Mizoguchi in Japan. These people watched, particularly American films, very closely. Hitchcock was very well versed, too, though, in German Expressionism and in Soviet montage techniques and so on. For his creative process, he needed that inspiration. He needed to see what other people had done so he could forge his own way. I think the same thing happens today. I think since the 1960s, we've come to expect, since the new wave, we've come to expect that to be a filmmaker is to be very film literate, to have lots of classic movies at your fingertips. So a Godard or a Truffaut can reference lots and lots of American and French films in their work. And nowadays you have real film geeks, I mean people like Wes Anderson or Paul Thomas Anderson, who embed their movies with lots and lots of references to the films they love. I suppose Scorsese would be the extreme example of that, but you get it even with Spielberg. That's generational, I think. For their creative process, those filmmakers had to come to terms with the past, either the past of classic films or the past of contemporary Hollywood. But at the same time today, you have great filmmakers, I think great filmmakers, who really don't know much about the history of cinema. I would pick out particularly two, Kitano Takeshi, the Japanese director, who is, he'll confess, not a film lover. He doesn't watch films. He made his first film without knowing anything about cinema, really. And Ho Xiaoshen, the great Taiwanese director, who again was no cinephile. I mean, since he's become a famous director, he's kind of back-channeled his education and watched a lot of older films. But when he started, he was not a film lover or felt he had to know any classic films. But their creative process is very different from that of somebody like a Scorsese or an Altman or other people who sort of knew classic films. So as I say, I take the it depends position, that it really depends on how you make your film, what your guiding or visionary company is. And it could be in the other arts, it could be in literature, it doesn't have to be film. I've never really felt very close to the arguments about the canon, I guess, because it doesn't really figure very much in my thinking. As a scholar, I think it's typical of my generation that we sort of thought ourselves to be Canon Busters. I mean, the generation before us had sort of sanctified a body of film, chiefly silent film, but it was emerging that, yes, Rules of the Game was a great film, M was a great film, people were gradually discovering film noir. And I think that the people like me who started to teach in the 70s thought really everything is fair game. A lot of us were influenced, I think, by contemporary European film and the new energy of contemporary American film at that time. People like Spielberg, Coppola, something like Apocalypse Now makes you rethink the war film, for instance. So I don't think that a lot of the people who are my contemporaries thought heavily about a canon. If by canon we mean the X number of films, 20, 30, 50 films, that are valuable and interesting regardless of your interests, regardless of what research questions you're asking, regardless of what your preferences and tastes are. These are the must-see films. There probably is such a list, but I wouldn't want to compile it. I mean, to me, what's interesting about cinema is, in a way, every movie is interesting to me if you ask the right question about it. If you're asking questions about film and what it can do as an expressive art form, a lot of films become very, very interesting. I probably draw the line at porn. I really haven't seen much porn I found very artistically interesting. Not that I've seen a lot of it either, by the way. But I do think that a lot of films in all genres, all types, from all countries, can get activated and become quite interesting and valuable depending on the perspective you bring to them. So for instance, to go to the teaching, the practical teaching aspects, in a course I might mix together a classic film, like say, might teach M or something like that, but also a film like say Beetlejuice, Tim Burton's film, which I personally admire a great deal. I think it's one of his best films, but even independent of that, it's a fascinating exercise in how you play with a genre, how you take, particularly in that case, The Exorcist in the tradition of exorcism films, and do something quite creative and comic with it. That's the particular question I was pursuing, and so that film becomes lively and interesting. But that doesn't mean I'm going to put Beetlejuice on my list of the top 50 films of all time. So a lot to me depends, again, on what angle you're approaching the stuff from. And so ideas of a timeless or eternal canon don't interest me so much, I have to say. And I haven't tried to make that the cornerstone of my teaching. So it's kind of a rearguard action to stick with 35, but I think we still think that that scale matters so much. It really, you saw an extreme case last night with Apocalypse Now, where movies are made to be seen really big, and that's varied across the history of cinema. If you go back and look at old theaters from the teens and the 20s, the screens weren't that big, really. It's really in the 30s and 40s that screens get bigger, then they shrink again, now they've gotten bigger again with IMAX and so forth. And filmmakers intuitively, and particularly cinematographers, do scale their work for the screens that they're aiming at. And as Richard mentioned, more and more in the 70s, filmmakers realized that films would mostly be seen by most audiences in perpetuity on a small screen, on TV or other monitor displays. So part of a movie like Apocalypse Now is just it doesn't just look better in a venue like the Virginia, but also it was designed to be seen in a venue like the Virginia. Whereas small indie films, a lot of them I think are made to be seen on small displays. People expect that mumblecore films, for instance, won't be shown on the Virginia theater screen. God, what would they look like, you know? But they really are aimed for that more intimate viewing experience. And if the film is aimed for that, I don't see any problem with watching it on that kind of display. For me, it's kind of going back to early film history, because if you remember, before there were feature films in the 1910s, most films were very short, a reel or less, I'd say 10 to 15 minutes or less, and they were shown in very distracting circumstances. Nickelodeons typically ran a half-an-hour program of 3 or 4 films. You'd walk in at any time of the day, every half hour, you'd walk in, pass a half hour, walk out. You know, it was a very small scale, short form, intimate kind of viewing, and the rise of the feature film sort of established a different paradigm. No, we go to the movies for an evening's entertainment, we see a feature, we see a couple shorts, we see a cartoon and so on. But before 1908, 10, 12, depending on where you start to date this stuff, people were very much into short form cinema. And in a way I see the internet as reinventing early cinema in that respect, with very short little things, bite-sized snackable films. That's a perfectly legitimate form as far as I'm concerned. People and creative things can be done with it.
Do you use it at all? I mean, do any of you use it in your teaching? Do you send people to specifically sort of say, see this on the web and not?
I wasn't in a situation when I was teaching to use it much, but I've sent links to friends, and I've watched some things on it that are quite interesting, I think. I wrote a blog about these videos that are these one-shot videos that are lip dubs, as they're called, that celebrate, actually a couple of rival high schools in, of all places, Colorado, started to make these very intricate tracking shots where they lip-synced to pop music. I thought they were pretty interesting films, actually, and then there's a whole tradition of this lip dub cinema developing on the internet. I think it's interesting.
Once Upon a Time in the West and Memento.
Okay. Go ahead.
2 Japanese movies, one by Ozu called Early Summer, and one by Mizoguchi called Sancho the Bailiff. As far as I'm concerned, cinema never got better than those 2 movies.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to say It Happened One Night, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
You get an A.
Forgive me, but Chinatown. And we've been talking mostly about the visual, but somehow the visual is used to get to the story. And the story is the thing that we have to have. And I'm thinking the second one, maybe it will be a classic, almost already a classic, Groundhog Day.
Okay.
I would say A Clockwork Orange and Apocalypse Now. Yeah.
What was the second one?
Apocalypse Now.
Gosh, I also would start with a French movie, Breathless, by Jean-Luc Godard, which is at the Osborne Fest, I guess, this week. They're going to show its 50th anniversary out for the Turner Classics. And then, yeah, there should be something animated in there. One of the things I would just say, I work on animation. A racist cartoon from the 40s says a lot about Hollywood, and I would say Jasper and the Watermelons.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Phil.
I'm going to go self-indulgent and schizoid. The Searchers and Agnes Varda's Cleo from 5 to 7.
Good.
Oh,
Very good.
wow.